Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight as we continue our Meet the Author series. I'd like to welcome you to Darien Library. My name is Erin Shea, and I'm the head of adult programming here. I would also like to briefly mention that programs at the library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign. So thank you so much for your continued support to make programs like these and our collections available to the community. Tonight's guest is Chief Investment Strategist at Legg Mason Capital Management. Prior to joining LMCM, he was an investment strategist at Credit Suisse. He is a former president of the Consumer Analyst Group of New York and was repeatedly named to Institutional Investors All-American Research Team and the Wall Street Journal All-Star Survey in the Food Industry Group. He is the author of Think Twice, Harnessing the Power of Counterintuition, More Than You Know, Finding Financial Wisdom in Unconventional Places, and co-author of Expectations Investing, Reading Stock Prices for Better Returns. Tonight, he is here to talk about his latest book, The Success Equation, Untangling Skill and Luck in Business, Sports, and Investing. Our guest has been an adjunct professor of finance at Columbia Business School since 1993 and is on the faculty of the Hale Brun Center for Graham and Dodd Investing. In 2009, he received the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence. Business Week's guide to the best business schools highlighted him as one of the school's outstanding faculty, a distinction received by only 7 professors. We are very proud also to say that this is his local library. He calls Darien, Connecticut home. Please join me in welcoming to the library Mr. Michael J. Mauboussin.
Here with friends and family. And the topic of the evening, of course, is the idea of skill and luck. And I want to launch into this by telling you a quick story. When I was a senior in college, I knew I needed to get a job, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do or could do. One of the firms that came to recruit on our campus, Georgetown University, was Drexel Burnham Lambert, at the time a very prominent investment bank. I did sufficiently well in my New York round interviews. I was my Washington interviews, invited to New York for the final round. So I got my best suit out, polished my shoes, went up there, and they sat us around a conference room table, all the candidates, and they said, here's how the day's going to go. You're going to have 6 interviews with various people from the training program, and then you're going to have 10 minutes with the head guy. So obviously you want to do well all day, but make sure you have your A game for that 10 minutes with the head guy. So I go through my interviews, they go about as well as can be expected. And then finally my moment comes with the big guy. So they come down this beautiful hallway with plush carpeting, he's got a beautiful office with a panoramic view of downtown Manhattan. And I noticed peeking out from underneath his very large desk was a trash can with the emblem of the Washington Redskins. Now, having gone to school in Washington, D.C., and being a sports fan and gone to a couple games, I said to him, awesome trash can. And this hit him right in the emotional seat. He went on for 10 minutes, spanning to 15 minutes, about his wonderful days in Washington, D.C., and how great the Redskins were, and how important athletics were in development. I'm basically going like this the whole time. So I leave, I go back to school, and sure enough, a week or 2 later, that coveted letter comes in the mail, and I get the job. It's really exciting. So I'm gainfully employed. So I go out and I started my training program. About 6 months into it, and you can tell this guy had been waiting to do this for a long time. About 6 months into it, one of the guys in the training program waves me over and pulls me aside, kind of puts his arm around me and says, you're doing fine, but now I can tell you the truth. He said, the 6 people you interviewed with, on balance, voted against hiring you. He said, but the head guy came down and said, you have to hire this kid, he's great. So my career was launched by a trash can. Pure luck. So what I'd like to talk about tonight are really 3 things. First, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of skill and luck and try to define some terms. And I think, hopefully up front, I'll give you some ideas that come out of that are somewhat counterintuitive. The second part I want to talk about what the shapes of skill and luck look like. And in particular, I think the most interesting part is how luck can evolve and how it can be somewhat unpredictable. And then finally, I want to finish with some on why it's so difficult for us to understand this, as well as some practical things that you can do to improve your skill or to manage your luck. So let me launch right into this. And I think the easiest way to think about this is a continuum, which you can imagine from the far left, pure luck, things like roulette wheels and lotteries. From the far right, pure skill. So that might be chess matches or running races. It's actually very important to determine, define the terms here, because especially luck very quickly spills into philosophy, moral philosophy. So I'm going to define skill right out of the dictionary, which is the ability to use one's knowledge readily in performance or execution. So you know how to do something, and when you're called on to do it, you can do it readily. Luck is a little bit more difficult, but I'm going to say that luck exists when three features are in place. The first is it happens to an individual or a group. So it could be you or your team or your company. Second is it can be positive or negative. And it needn't be symmetrically positive or negative, but there's going to be a positive side and a negative side. And the third, probably the most important one, is it's reasonable to expect a different outcome could have occurred. It's reasonable to expect a different outcome could have occurred. By the way, here I've arrayed professional sports leagues based on 1 seasons of activity. So this is where they actually lie in the skill-up continuum. That's the NBA on the far right, Barclays Premier League Soccer, Major League Baseball, NFL, and the NHL. And by the way, there's a really interesting and intriguing simple test to determine whether there's any skill in an activity. And that is, ask whether you can lose on purpose. If you can lose on purpose, there is going to be some skill in that activity. By the way, for the investors in the group, I'll mention investing is particularly interesting because, as we all know, it's difficult to build portfolios that do better than the market over time. But it turns out it's actually pretty hard to build portfolios that do a lot worse than the market over time as well. So that tells you that while there is skill, there's a good dash of luck in that as well. So I'm going to give you this very quick graphic of a way to visualize this as a setup for something I'll talk about in just a moment. So you could imagine the pure luck side as a distribution of luck. It doesn't really look like that, but just for now. And 0, basically all zeros from skill. So luck determines all of your outcomes. The pure skill side would be the mirror image. So a distribution of skill, no luck whatsoever. And of course, most of the things in the world are some combination of those two. So figuring out the balance between those two is really the key thing for us. Now, as I said, I think there are 3 very quick lessons that we can take away from just that very simple model. The first and foremost first one is that whenever you see an outlier in sports, in business, in investing, it has to be the combination of really good skill and really good luck combined. It's almost axiomatic that you need to be really good at both of those to have some sort of outlier performance. One of the best ways we know to study this is streaks in sports, for example. So here, of course, is Joe DiMaggio, who in 1941 hit 56 straight games. Turns out that all the baseball players with 30 or more game hitting streaks have career batting averages over 300. They're all really outstanding players. So saying this differently, not all skillful players have streaks, but all streaks are held by skillful players. True for business, true for investing, true for sports. The second lesson is about reversion to the mean. And reversion mean specifically says when you have an outcome that's a lot above or below average, the expected value of the next outcome is something closer to the average. This is a classic example. If you took a stats class many years ago, you learned about Pearson's correlation. This is actually Pearson's data. And that's the height of fathers and sons, their stature. And you can just eyeball this. You can see tall fathers, you see at the extreme tall, they're about 8 inches taller than average. And they tend to have tall sons, but they're not as tall as they are. They're only 4 inches taller than average. Likewise, short fathers have short sons, but their sons are closer to average than they are. Now here's the key thing as it relates to skill and luck. It turns out when an activity is all dictated by skill, there is no reversion to mean at all. In other words, I could line some people up and have them run a running race. Fastest person wins. Line them up again, run again. Same people win. No reversion to the mean. When you have all luck, the expected value of the next outcome is something like the average, or the mean, or the median, or something like that. So where you are on the skill-luck continuum defines the rate of reversion to the mean as well. Very important concept in a lot of parts of life. And the last lesson I find also to be one of the most fascinating. It's something I call the paradox of skill. And the paradox of skill says, in activities where there is some luck, as skill improves, luck becomes more important in determining outcomes. So in activities where there's some luck, as skill improves, luck becomes more important in determining outcomes, hence the paradox. Now, I learned about this from the eminent biologist Stephen Jay Gould, who was one of the great evolutionary theorists, but he also loved to write about baseball. And one of his most famous essays was about Ted Williams. Also in 1941 season, Ted Williams hit over 400, 406 to be precise. And Gould wondered, why is it that no one has hit over 400 since Ted Williams achieved that feat in 1941? He said maybe it's because the players play at night now and they can't see as well, maybe they travel more, maybe they're relief pitchers. None of these things actually checked out. And they said maybe Ted Williams was just, a giant among mortals. He was just that much better than everybody else. And he said, no, but if you look at other sports that are measured versus the clock, everyone's gotten better. That doesn't seem plausible. Turns out the reason that no one has hit 406 is because everyone's gotten better in baseball. They're drawing from a population around the world, better coaching techniques, better training techniques, better nutrition, and as a result, the variance in performance of skill has gone down. The standard deviation of performance of skilled players have gone down. And the way that translates is that the standard deviation or the variance of batting average has gone down. So to make it more concrete, the standard deviation of batting average in 1941 was 0.032, and now it's 0.028. Or saying it differently, Ted Williams is what is called the 4 sigma event, 4 standard deviations away from normal in 1941. If you were to achieve that feat in 2011, you would hit 380. Now 380 is obviously awesome, but it's a far cry from 406 because skill has become more uniform. So here's a way to represent this visually. I put on the right-hand side a level of peak performance. So I'm doing this so humans can only run so fast or swim so swiftly. And if you look what's happening over time as you go from one distribution to the other, and there are 2 things I want to draw your attention to. One is the distance from the average performance to the peak performance has gotten shorter. So everybody's moving toward peak performance in the population. And second is the right-hand side of that distribution, the right tail has gotten steeper, the slope is steeper. And that means the results are more clustered. Now the paradox of skill makes a very specific prediction, which is in realms where there is no luck at all, you should see 2 things. One is absolute performance improvement, and second is everybody's results getting tighter with one another. And let me show you how that's exactly what we see. This is Olympic men's marathon times, last 80 years or so. The white line is the time of the gold medal winner. And to give you some sense, the guy that won the marathon in 2012 in England ran 23.5 minutes faster than the guy who won the gold medal in 1932. So if you're a runner, it's about a minute a mile. That's a pretty good improvement even over 80 years. But the more interesting one is the blue line, which is the difference between the guy who came in first, the gold medal winner, and the guy who came in 20th. In 1932, that was 39 minutes. In other words, the gold medal guy collected his medal, took a shower, was eating a sandwich, and the other guy's still plodding along and coming across the finish line. In 2012, it's down to 7.5 minutes. And you see this consistently in every, for example, track and field, crew races, same basic pattern you see over and over. Paradox of skill. Now, by the way, for those in business, for those in investing, you can see how this ports right over very easily. As people become more skillful, the results get tighter, and the luck becomes more important in determining outcomes. So let me shift gears a little bit, and what I want to do is, rolling up my sleeves a bit, is talk about how do you actually place activities on this continuum from pure luck to pure skill. In the book, I offer 3 different ways to do this with varying analytical complexity, but I want to share with you the one I think is by far the most intuitive way to do this. And I do this through an analysis of the National Football League. This is win-loss records for teams. So on the top is the actual empirical record for the win-loss records for teams. You can see for the 5 years ended 2011. And the question is, in those win-loss records, how much of that is from skill and how much is that from luck? And one of the ways to do this, I think intuitively, is to say, what would the world look like if it were at one or the other extreme? So let's say, what would the world look like if there were only skill determining outcomes? Bless you. And the way you do that is you'd say, there are 32 teams, We randomly assign them a number from 1 to 32. And then we say team 1 always beats team 2 and so forth. Then we put them into the NFL scheduling algorithm, which is actually complicated. And then you simulate the world 10,000 times. That's a lot of effort, and that's the picture that comes out of that, right? This little arc, and there are always bumps on the end, right? Because the number 1 team is always 16-0, the number 32 team is always 0-16. But that's what that pattern is. So this is the pure abstract skill world. Now what would the world look like if it were pure luck? In this case, you know, the Redskins and the Giants come to midfield, somebody flips a coin, whoever calls it right wins the game, they go back to the locker room, shower, and go home, right? It's a binomial distribution. It's basically a coin toss. So what we do is now we have these two extremes, is we breed them in the exact proportions that gives us the best fit with the actual empirical data. And you can see, just visualizing, what happens is the luck model pulls the middle up from the skill model, and then the skill model pushes out the sides of the luck model. And it turns out for football, by the way, it's about 50-50, so happens. It's about 50-50. But you can repeat this for any activity that you like. So this is one of the intuitive ways to try to place things on the skill luck continuum. Ask what would the world look like in these extremes. Okay. Let me turn to the second part of this discussion, which is, and I've been sort of depicting skill as static and luck as sort of static. Of course, these are very dynamic. The first, and I'll start this with simply physical tasks, is this idea called the arc of skill. In very common sense. As you age, you get better and better at a certain activity, and then you peak, and then you come down back the other side. By the way, in sports, athletic endeavors, the best proxy for this is fast twitch versus slow twitch muscle. Fast twitch muscle, you peak when you're young. More slow twitch, you peak when you're older. So for example, sprinters peak around 22 to 24 years old. Hockey players about 26. Baseball players 27 to 29 years old. Anybody a golfing fan? Golf's best news there is out there. Golfers peak around 30 to 35. They plateau around 35, but they do go south after 35. So there's our buddy Tiger Woods, who's now just going over the edge in terms of his age. So that makes some common sense. Now let's talk what's more. Oh no, here's an example. I want to give you one example of this, and this is from the world of tennis. These are the winners of the men's Grand Slam tournaments in the open era, so 1968 through 2012, and this is exactly the arc of skill. So the top is the frequency by age of the winners, and it turns out the most frequent age, the average and the mode is all the same number, which is 24 years old. So that is the peak age for men's tennis players, 24. Women is just a bit younger than that. The bottom panel is the age of the winner by tournament, going back to 1968, and I drew a line at age 30. What it turns out is only about 5% of the players who've won Grand Slams are over the age of 30. And you can see a lot of them were sort of clustered in the early 1970s. By the way, I was very interested to see Roger Federer won Wimbledon this summer, age 30. Kind of the old timer getting it done. So I was curious, it was his 17th slam. So I was curious about what was Federer's average age for all of his Grand Slams. And it turns out 24.9 years old. And before he won Wimbledon, it was 24.6 years old. Right on the numbers. So I love Roger Federer, but he's 31 years old. It's going to be really a tough go for him going forward. Now let's talk about cognitive tasks, much more relevant for our group here. A little good news, bad news situation here. So psychologists like to talk about your cumulative cognitive performance being a combination of two kinds of intelligence. First is your fluid intelligence, and that is your ability to cope with novelty, ability to deal with new situations. And the second is crystallized intelligence, which is basically your cumulative knowledge. Things like vocabulary, facts, and so forth. Exactly what it sounds like. So there's the good news, bad news. The bad news is fluid intelligence peaks in your early 20s and goes straight downhill throughout your life. Once you're out of college, it's not good. The good news is crystallized intelligence goes up pretty much throughout your life. So that's good. It can plateau around your 80s if you have no cognitive issues, but it goes up most of your life. And then your performance, your aggregate cognitive performance is going to be the combination of these two. Now there was something really interesting. There was a fascinating piece of research by an economist at Harvard named David Leibson. And he tried to figure out what is the age of optimal age for financial decisions. So this is kind of household financial decisions. At what age do people get the lowest interest rates, on their mortgages, at what age they get the best terms for their credit cards, all those sort of household finance issues. And it turns out the optimal age for financial decision-making in families is 53, which I found a little bit surprising, candidly. So you can see why younger people may not be so good, because they don't have a lot of money and they don't have a lot of experience. So you think people in their 60s and perhaps 70s, they've been around, they have more wealth, they have more at stake, typically, not quite as good. So what's going on, and this is obviously giving a clue, and the answer, I think probably the simplest answer is, as we get older, we get cognitively lazy. We rely more on rules of thumb and our experience, and we fail to recruit parts of our mind to try to solve problems effectively. So I want to give you a little example, a little taste of how this actually works. I'm going to walk you through this mechanism. We'll see how this goes today. This is a little, please, there is an answer to this. Please don't shout out whatever you think the answer is. Keep it in your mind. But here's the setup. Everyone will be able to do this. This is not complicated. Jack is looking at Anne, and Anne is looking at George. Jack is looking at Anne, Anne is looking at George. Jack is married, and George is unmarried. That's the setup. Now here's the question. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? So Jack is married, he's looking at Anne. Anne is looking at George, who's unmarried. The question is a married person looking at an unmarried person? So 3 possible answers. A, yes. B, no. C, cannot be determined based on the information you provided to me. Okay, we're on the honor system here, right? Okay, so how many people will be A, yes? The answer is yes. How many people say B, no? How many people say, thank you, good vote? How many people say C, cannot be determined based on the facts? Right. The answer is, I like the young man's answer in the back, but that wasn't right. But I'm glad that he voted. That was good. The answer is A. But let me come right in behind all you C's, because I can see what happens when you're a C. Here's what you did, right? You said, okay, I know there's something up here, but here's the basic drill. Jack is looking at Anne. This is one pair. I know Jack's married, but I don't know Anne's marital status, so I can't figure it out based on that. The second pair is Anne looking at George. I know George's marital status, but I still don't know Anne's marital status, so I can't figure it out based on that either. So 2 pairs, one I don't know the answer to, so I can't tell based on this information. Now, of course, right, you get this after a while, Anne only has 2 possible marital statuses. She's either married or she's unmarried. That's it. So by inserting either one of those things, you can solve the problem. So let's say first, she's unmarried. Jack is looking at Anne, she's unmarried. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? The answer is yes. Now flip and say she's married. She's looking at George. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? The answer is yes. So if you write out all the combinations, the answer has to be yes. Now note that there's a little voice in your head once you first go, it's jumping up and down going, we can't tell, not enough information, right? And the other part of your brain's going, yeah, that's probably right. But if you recruit that part of your brain to help you solve that problem, and you just even write it on a piece of paper, you're going to get the right answer. By the way, everybody here would get the right answer if I gave you enough time. I'm rushing through this a little bit. But part of it was the automatic reaction. Notice the automatic reaction. So this is what we do in our decision making. This is the lesson. This is truly what happens. This is the mental processes we go through. We become cognitively lazy. We don't recruit parts of our mind to solve these kinds of problems. Okay, now I want to talk about luck, and this is one of the really fascinating dimensions. And I'm going to try to break luck into sort of 2 components. One is the world that's basically independent, where outcomes are independent of one another. And you can think about rolls of dice and roulette wheels and that kind of stuff. And then the second is where events are non-independent. So the technical term is path dependence. In other words, what happened before affects what's going to happen next. And I want to talk about the first one, but the second one in particular, 2 things I'm going to emphasize to you. That one is there's an inherent lack of predictability when there's path dependence. And second, there's extraordinary inequality when there's path dependence. So I'm going to tell you a story about that in a moment. But first, let me start with independent conditions. And one example is just baseball hitters. Now here I'm showing you obviously Babe Ruth, but in the book we actually did a guy named Adam Jones, who plays for the Baltimore Orioles, who hit 280 for the 2011 season. And we created an incredibly simple spinner model. Literally, you spin the thing, 28% of the time it gets a hit, 72% of the time it gets an out, and then you simulate this 10,000 times. So you have all the statistical properties of 10,000 Adam Jones season with this spinner model. And it turns out the statistical properties of that and what he actually did are pretty close. Not exactly. It's not perfectly independent. I don't want to claim that it is. But it's close enough for all intents and purposes, for what you need to know when you're managing baseball players. So this independent model actually does work, in especially systems that are fairly simple and fairly closed. Things get much more interesting when you turn to these path-dependent processes, often with substantial social dimensions behind them. And I want to introduce this by telling you the story of a painting. I guess I'll pose it as a question. Which would you say, unprompted, is the most famous painting in the world? And my hint is the people in this picture are looking at the painting right now. What would you say? Mona Lisa. Right? So the history of the Mona Lisa, many of you probably know, was painted by Leonardo da Vinci in the early 1500s. In the 1517 or 1519, went to France and has been in France basically the whole time since then. Now the question I want to ask you is, why? Why is the Mona Lisa the most famous painting in the world? And by the way, when asked, 85% of people will say the Mona Lisa. Again, unprompted, all over the world. Number two is Sunflowers by Van Gogh. It's got 4% market share. It's not even close, right? So what's going on? So if you ask an art critic, they might say something like this. Da Vinci brilliantly used a technique to portray movement in the background. He used oil paintings, which at the time, in the early 1500s, very unusual. And of course, everybody falls back on the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa. By the way, I went to see the Mona Lisa when I was a kid. I don't know how many people have actually been there to see it. It's that, when you go there, it's very, I'm like, what is the big deal, right? It's like, it's not that big, it's way off, and I'm like, I'm not sure I get this. Well, I've seen it, but I'm not sure I get it. So I want to tell you the story of the Mona Lisa to try to give you some sense of how she got into this position. And what I want to emphasize is that she was not always the most famous painting in the world. In fact, she was far from being the most famous painting in the world. And I'm going to tell you two specific stories to back that up. The first is, for most of her time in France, she was in Versailles. And this is now around 1750. They decided to take the top 110 pieces of art from Versailles, bring them to Paris for an art show. 1750. She's been around for 250 years, right? Not a new kid on the block. 250 years. Top 110 pieces from Versailles to Paris. Mona Lisa doesn't make the cut. Not considered in the top 110 pieces. In Versailles, not even in the world, in Versailles. Around 1800, after spending, she spent 2 or 3 years in Napoleon's bedroom, actually. Then she went to the Louvre, around 1800. In 1850, the Louvre brought in art experts to value all the paintings in the Louvre. It turns out, when they did that evaluation, 1849 officially, the Mona Lisa was not even the most valuable Da Vinci painting. She was valued at 60% of another Da Vinci painting. And in fact, she was, there were Raphael's deemed to be worth 6 to 7 times what the Mona Lisa was worth. Now at this point, she's been around for 350 years, right? So this is not a new piece of art. So what's going on? What happened? Very interesting story. 1911, a kind of disgruntled Italian painter stayed overnight at the Louvre on a Sunday night. Monday, the Louvre's closed. Woke up, went over, took her off the peg, put her in his jacket, and walked out the door. Stole the painting. It's created an international sensation. Her picture was on the newspaper day after day. This incredible mystery, what's going on. Became an international sensation. By the way, this guy was a bit crazy. He just took the painting and he put it under his stove for 2 years and just sat there, did nothing. He eventually figures, I should probably do something with this. So he wrote a letter to an art dealer in Florence and said, I've got the Mona Lisa. And as a patriotic Italian, she should come home. I'll bring her to you for $2.5 million. So he brings her back and they verify that it's her. She did a little time in Italy and then came right back to France. But when she came back to France, again, another round of fanfare. Hundreds of thousands of people lined up to see her. This again splashed under the mystery has been solved and this incredible thing. So that really catapulted her into consciousness. And from there, she became really part of modern culture. Right? This is Marcel Duchamp, very famous French artist. And this is the famous parody of Mona Lisa with her mustache and her little beard. And if you know a little bit of French, this little phrase down here is sort of a salacious phrase, so it's a little on the saucy side. This also came over to our shores. Nat King Cole, 1950, #1 hit, and an Oscar-winning song was Mona Lisa. So this is what catapulted her, is this a catalyzing event perpetuated by these other social processes. Now, what I want to say is the Mona Lisa is a very, very fine painting, and she's always been considered to be a very fine painting. But the reason she's the most famous painting in the world is pure luck. It was a series of process that would say if you played the world over and over, it would very unlikely be the case. Now, the problem with what I just said is there's no way to prove it. You can't prove it one way or another. In other words, we only lived in the world once. We don't have alternate universes to check out my ideas. It turns out, though, scientists in recent years have figured out how to test this, and it's actually pretty cool. This is done by a trio of scientists at Columbia University, sociologists. There's an experiment called Music Lab. And let me set this up for you. So here's what they did. About 15,000 people participated, so it was a fairly big thing. It is ostensibly about musical taste. So the subject comes into the website, and they're shown 48 songs by unknown bands. Okay, so they tested to make sure that no one's ever heard of these bands. And then the subjects rate them. I love it, 5 stars. I hate it, 1 star. And if you like it, you can download the song. Right? So that's the setup. Again, ostensibly they're there to contribute their musical tastes. Now, unbeknownst to the subject, when they came in, 20% went to what they called an independent world. So they randomized the songs, love it, hate it, download what you want, but the key is you could not see what anybody else did. You were in effect in the music store by yourself. The other 80% came in and they went 10% each into 8 social worlds. In these social worlds, the starting positions were identical to the independent world. Initial, starting, exactly the same. But then, the difference was you could see what people before you did. So you could see, I love it, I hate it, and you could see the pattern of downloads. And so the question the researchers want to know was, in a sense, we're living 8 parallel universes. Does social influence affect how people choose about things? And the answer is absolutely and extraordinarily. So probably the best song that typifies this experiment is a song called Lockdown by a band called 52 Metro. It was number 26 in the independent world. It was right in the middle, perfectly average. But in one of the other worlds, it was the #1 hit. And another social world, it was number 40. Now, the researchers found that really bad songs almost never did super well. But if you were good to very good, you had a very good chance of being a hit. So again, inherently unpredictable. It's sometimes very hard to accept. However, once something has happened, everybody starts to think that it's really good. And I was invited to write an article for Time.com. And I wrote an article, and of course I had to lead with the current viral hit. Gangnam Style, which is now the most viewed video in the history of YouTube. I think it's now approaching 900 million views. And what you probably don't know, I don't know if we're going to be able to do this, Aaron, we'll do it afterwards, but what you probably don't know, and one of the reasons Gangnam Style has done so well, by the way, it's a bit of a catchy tune, it's got some good dance moves, but it's been parodied by many, many groups. There have been flash mobs at Cornell and MIT and so on and so forth. But I don't know if you know this, but our very own Darien library has its own Gangnam Style video. And maybe at the end we'll turn that on for you. You can check out our wonderful taxpayer dollars at work Gangnam Style video. Darien library. Couldn't be better. Couldn't be better. So I mentioned this idea of a lack of predictability, which is very much true. The other thing I mentioned was this fundamental inequality, which is to say, 2 products of very similar quality can have vastly different outcomes. Now you've heard about this probably, winner take all or winner take most type of markets. But I want to give you an example from a product called Stephen King. Now Stephen King's first big novel was 1973, Carrie. You may remember this, and it was a major motion picture, did very, very well. Stephen King, though, started pumping out novels every year, and they were very successful. So this guy commercially off and running. Now, he was a very prolific guy. So he was producing more than 1 novel a year. And the publisher said, you know, by rule of the industry, really, you can't do more than 1 novel a year. So he's got these novels piling up. So what he decides to do is start publishing novels under a pseudonym. And his pseudonym is Richard Bachman. Richard, because there was a Richard Stark novel on his desk when he came up with this idea. And Bachman, because Bachman Turner Overdrive was playing on the radio. You ain't seen nothing yet. So he published 5 or 6 books under the name Richard Bachman and Stephen King, right? All commercial flops. Nobody cares. The last one he published was in the early 1980s called Thinner. Again, sort of commercially sort of languishing. The guy, a clerk in Washington, D.C. bookstore, reads this book and reads 2 pages, says, it's got to be Stephen King. This guy sounds exactly like Stephen King. He's motivated enough to go down to the Library of Congress and actually check it out, and he finds quickly that Stephen King indeed owns the copyrights to Richard Bachman. So he calls him out, and the whole thing is blown. What's fascinating is, from the time Richard Bachman was selling that book to the time they flipped it over to Stephen King on the title, sales went up a factor of 10. 10-fold increase in sales. Same exact book, same exact content, same exact style, but now with a Stephen King name attached to it. Fundamental inequality. 2 things of the same quality can have vastly different outcomes in this kind of a world, and that is, again, driven almost exclusively by luck. Now, I want to finish the discussion today with one of the main, I think this is one of the most fascinating dimensions of this, is why are we so bad at understanding the role of luck? So if I say to you, the future has skill and luck in terms of the outcomes, everybody gets that, right? But once something has happened, things get a lot more complicated. And the reason is there's a part of your brain in your left hemisphere that is specifically dedicated to figuring out cause and effect. By the way, it's a fascinating story how neuroscientists figured this out. The primary researcher on this is a guy named Michael Gazzaniga, and the work was on split brain patients. Now, these people are typically epileptics that have very debilitating seizures. And there's almost no way to treat the seizures effectively besides severing the corpus callosum, which is the bundle of nerves between the 2 hemispheres of your brain. By the way, they start doing this. They had no idea how these people would come out. They started doing it in the 40s. They didn't know what people would be like after the surgery. Are they going to feel like normal, or are they going to feel like 2 different people in the same head, or whatever? Turns out people are totally, they feel fine after these surgeries. It actually helps them dramatically, and they feel fine. But that sets up an extraordinary experimental condition where they can feed information to the right hemisphere, which has no language abilities, and then they can ask the person what's going on, and their left hemisphere can answer. So it turns out there's part of your left hemisphere dubbed the interpreter, and its job is to create a story to link a cause to every effect that it observes. It's an absolutely phenomenal, and by the way, the key thing is the interpreter knows nothing about luck. Oh, and people think that this evolved many years ago, and it conferred a major evolutionary advantage, because if you understood cause and effect, and this is one of the things that distinguishes humans from other animals, it can be of great value. The second part that's related to this is the role of narrative in all this, the role of stories. And it turns out a lot of the skill luck stuff requires some statistical work. And humans are horrible at statistics. Humans are really good at stories. Your brain is really good at stories. So if you're going to communicate with a story or a statistic, the story will win every single time. There's a wonderful book written by Jonathan Gottschall, came out earlier this year, called The Storytelling Animal. It's really on this whole theme. And I'll just read this quote. And this is really about the interpreter. And by the way, while we know that these exist in these split brain patients, the fact is we all have the same thing. The storytelling mind is allergic to uncertainty, randomness, and coincidence. It is addicted to meaning. If the storytelling mind cannot find meaningful patterns in the world, it will impose them. In short, the storytelling mind is a factory that turns out true stories when it can, but will manufacture lies when it can't. Something happens, your mind creates a story, you put the issue to rest, and then in the archives, and then on to the next thing. And then there's something called creeping determinism, which you start to believe that what happened was inevitable. It had to happen only that way, because your mind doesn't want to reopen the case in effect. I'll just give you a couple examples of this. One was a really interesting paper written by an academic named Andrew Lowe, who's at MIT, where he studied the recent financial crisis. And what he did is he took 20 papers, roughly half by journalists, half by academics, and he read them to see if are there common causes that everybody would agree upon that would have caused the financial crisis. And it turns out, absolutely none. There's some overlap, but many different causes from all these different people. And in fact, some of them contradicted one another. So there really was no consistent theme whatsoever. This also spills into the world of business and sort of advice giving in general. There's a whole industry of folks who write books, these are consultants and academics, on how to succeed in business. And here's the basic model, and by the way, it's incredibly intuitive. What they do is they look at very successful companies, they extract from those companies a handful of attributes, and they say, if you embrace those attributes, you too will be successful. Now here's the problem. What if those companies are successful because of luck? What lessons are you going to learn from them? Right, so it'd be something like this. I line up 10 people and I ask them to call coin tosses. And some of them get 8 in a row correct. And some of them get only 2 in a row correct. All of a sudden you're going to say, well, what are these 8 in a row guys doing so well? What can I learn from them? Now, it turns out until recently, no one really knew how much of corporate performance was a function of luck and how much was a function of skill. But a handful, a trio of researchers actually looked at this very recently. So what they basically do is they look at the parameters of corporate performance. This is over 50 years, lots of companies, very rich data. And then they take the data and the parameters, and then they simulate the world. So it's like music lab. They simulate the world over and over. And then they can see how much of performance is attributable just to the system itself, and whether there are companies that truly are excellent. And by the way, there are. There are some companies that do better than random chance will dictate. Then they took that template and they applied it to these books. 11 most popular books. Built to Last, In Search of Excellence, Good to Great, all these popular books, which have sold millions upon millions of copies. And what they found was only 13% of the companies identified could be confidently called skillful. 87% were there because of luck. So once again, the question to ask, how much can you learn from luck? And the answer, I assume, is not much. Let me finish with this. What do we do about all this? So first on the skill thing, when you're talking about improving a skill, you really have to distinguish where you are on the continuum. On the far right-hand side, where you're on the full skill side, the key here is deliberate practice. And many of you probably heard about this. This has been very popular in the last few years. 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. And 10,000 hours of deliberate practice means you're practicing right outside your ability, you're getting coaching, you're getting feedback, and you're working really hard at this. It's got a very specific definition. It's hard to do. Very few people actually do it effectively. But the key to deliberate practice is the feedback is very tight. In other words, the outcomes reflect your skill almost perfectly. So if you're learning to play the piano, you play 1 week, you're not very good. You play 6 months later, you're better. By listening to your playing, we can tell how your skills improve. They correlate almost perfectly. When you move over to the luck side, that connection between your skill and your outcomes becomes broken. In other words, you can do things well from a process point of view and lose, or do things poorly and win. And a great example is blackjack. If I want to know if Brian's a good blackjack player, I can do 1 of 2 things. I can hand him $1,000, say, go to Fox with good luck, bring me back whatever money's stuffed in your pocket at the end of the night, and then I can evaluate him that way, outcome-based. Or I can give him $1,000 and then go watch him play. Look over his shoulder, and I know their standard blackjack strategy, which will give him the best odds of success over time. The key is to the process is ultimately a good process leads to better outcomes. In the short term, it doesn't show up. The feedback is not clear. So when you're talking about luck orientation, you want to have process. And I won't go into this, but process, I would always say, has 3 components to it. An analytical piece, represented by my calculator, a behavioral piece, which is how we think and make decisions, and then finally, an organization piece. I'll finish on this on luck. By the way, luck is interesting because whenever I say that I'm writing something about skill and luck, people always trot out all these aphorisms about luck, right? And I list them all at the beginning of the book. Luck is where preparation meets opportunity. You work hard to make your luck. Now, those are all very important sentiments. I agree with the sentiments. By my definition, note that those are not correct. If there's something you can do to improve your situation, that's a skill. So preparation is really good. Working hard is really good. Grit is really hard, but those are things that are in your control. So one way to think about what's in your control and what's out of your control. So how might you manage luck? And I'm just going to give you 2 ideas. The first, by the way, is the story, is I depicted beautifully by the story of David and Goliath. And by the way, everybody probably knows the story, but it was actually fascinating to go back and actually reread the text. It's a really interesting, very, very cool story. But as you recall, Goliath is this big dude. He's like 6'6", huge guy, 130 pounds of armor, and he comes out and he says, I'll fight anybody in the Israelites, and whoever kills the other guy gets to take the other army as slaves. This incredible, And so these guys are all quaking in their boots, and along comes David, this little guy, he's a little shepherd boy. He's the youngest of 8. He's actually there to deliver stuff to his older brothers. So he's like, he said, what's going on? What's going on? Oh, this big guy Goliath, he's threatening us. You know, if you kill him, you get to marry the king's daughter, get all these riches. He's like, that's a pretty good deal. He's a shepherd boy, so he spends all his days shooting a slingshot. So the first thing they do, which is fascinating, is they say, all right, you're going to go fight Goliath. Good, that's cool. Here's the armor. So they put the armor on. He's going to move around. He's this little kid. He's like, no armor. I'm getting rid of that. I'm going to take five stones out of the creek, and he killed him with a slingshot. It was effectively guerrilla warfare. And this is the lesson. And by the way, it's extremely simple, yet unbelievable how often it's ignored. If you were the favorite in a game, simplify the game. That way you can be sure that your skill overwhelms the competitor. If you were the underdog, complicate the game. Make it as complicated as possible. So for example, in sports, if you're the favorite, you want the game plan to be as simple as possible. If you're the underdog, trick plays, unusual patterns. Keep the other guy. In warfare, if you're the favorite, asymmetric warfare, fight on your terms. If you're the underdog, guerrilla tactics. Do things that are off the beaten path. In business, if you're the favorite guy, if you're the underdog, disruptive innovations. So amazingly simple advice, unbelievably how often it's ignored. The other thing I'll say is little bets. This is another area that what we're trying to do is tease out causality. And basically what technology is allowing us to do is make these little bets that allow us to understand exactly cause and effect. There's a famous phrase in advertising that half our advertising budget's wasted, we just don't know which half it is. So now companies are being able to figure this out. I will mention, I know everybody's got all this fatigue from the political season, me as well, but I will mention one thing that's interesting. For many, many years, politicians just spent a lot of money, and I would say somewhat willy-nilly. TV ads, radio ads, so forth. They didn't really know what the efficacy was of all their spending. About 15 or 20 years ago, but really the last five years, much sharper focus. The political scientists have come in now and are using these kind of methods, these little bet methods, to actually figure out the effectiveness of marketing. So they would say, oh, we'll run radio ads in this town and in this town that are demographically similar, and then we'll measure the effect. And we'll know what works and what doesn't. We'll send out an email that looks like this, an email that looks like that, and we'll measure the effects. And by doing this, you can get much, much more effective in your marketing. And that's part of what happened in the Democratic victories. The Democrats were using a lot of these techniques that apparently were reasonably effective toward the end. So then I'll stop. I guess there are 3 things I want to hopefully leave you with. And number one is some of the definitions and thinking about skill and luck. It's obviously out there a lot. But the main thing I want to leave you with is this idea that we're very bad at understanding the role of luck. And this is because of our interpreter in our minds, this idea of cause and effect. And we're very quick and very concrete. So that we tend to underestimate that. The second thing I want to leave you with is that there are analytical methods to know where you are in that luck skill continuum. And you can also understand how skill changes over time. And you can understand various patterns of luck. And just being aware of those things can be very helpful. There's a whole chapter, which I didn't mention, about what makes for a useful statistic. So we swim in statistics in our world today, but we know that they're not all created equally. So what are the tests to figure out which statistics are useful, which aren't? And then finally, the last section of the book is hopefully very practical. So trying to give you some concrete ways to think about how to improve your skill, how to manage luck, a whole discussion of reversion to me and some final thoughts. So the idea is not just to recognize that there's a lot of randomness and we're not good at this, but also what we should do about it specifically. I'll mention lastly, I give a last plug on this, is the success equation has a dedicated website, success-equation.com. And it's got a lot of fun little simulations, so a lot of these different models, these social models, very simple versions of them, you can play around with them. There's a tennis model. My favorite one's called Mind Reader. So this is an algorithm that if you're trying to figure out how random your patterns are in ones and zeros, and it reads your patterns, and then it can anticipate, if you're not random, it figures out your patterns, and then it beats you with this little game. So that's pretty kind of cool thing. I'll also mention too, since we're in Darien, this is my last thing. If anybody love to buy the book, by the way, if anybody wants to buy copies, have me sign them, gifts for Christmas, whatever it is, very happy to do that. So I'm around and would be more than happy to do that. So with that, I'll stop. And I'd be very happy, there's the website for this, and I'd be very happy to take any questions or comments or any thoughts anybody has. Yes?
if you take the panoply of stuff in the book that you wrote about and studied, what's the one that's had the most effect on the way, if you've changed anything about your business life or your personal life from lessons?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess the two things that probably jump out at me, one is this idea, really internalizing this idea of the interpreter, this idea that that once something has happened, our minds are very quick to figure out the cause and to close the case. So this idea of trying to keep your mind open to understand, basically counterfactual thinking, just always, I was going to say, you have to recognize the past could have had more outcomes than they had to understand how the future will have more outcomes. That would be one big one. And the other one, which I think is sort of this inexorable force that people don't talk a lot about, is the paradox of skill. Which is, interestingly, I was asked to write another article, not from the book. So I did more research in the world of business. I did a lot of work on sports, and clearly it's a big issue for investing. And it's a very pervasive force. And I think it's not something we're used to. So in other words, companies, for example, companies are getting better and better at what they do, but it's a relative game. So they offset one another, so they're absolutely better, but they're relatively lucky, more lucky in terms. So those would be two things that I would point out. Yeah?
Does luck play a major role in investing? If it does, should fees be reduced?
Yeah, I mean, I think let me first say that. It's funny because today I was in Philadelphia at one of the CFA conferences with Jack Bogle. Jack spoke right after me this morning, so this is the Jack Bogle thing. Let me first say that there's been a lot of talk about luck in investing. I think that there is unquestionably differential skill in investing. Some people are better at it than others, and I think that even after the fact, we can for sure see that, and there are even some indications that people can see that going forward. So I think that there is differential skill. The challenge is to figure out who's got the skill ahead of time, and there are some ways to do that, which I won't go into, although I talk a fair bit about that in the book. But your point, it's an interesting issue about in investing. If people have skill, they're worth a lot, right? Because they can really generate high returns. So if the paradox of skill is true, perhaps you should be paying low in the aggregate. You should be paying less than you did, say, 20 or 30 years ago. But there is differential skill, and there are opportunities